Amid the flood of immigration-related orders from President Donald Trump's administration came a Department of Homeland Security decision in late February to terminate Haitian and Venezuelan temporary protected status, which some people might be familiar with as TPS. Broadly speaking, in situations like ongoing armed conflict, that could include a civil war, or environmental disasters like an earthquake or hurricane or epidemic, the U.S. government can designate nationals of a foreign country for TPS if they temporarily cannot return safely. The decision to cancel that status is already facing suit from a Massachusetts-based civil rights organization. I'm Jennifer Smith, and this is the Codcast, Commonwealth Beacon's podcast about policy and civic life here in Massachusetts. We're recording this on Thursday, March 6th, one day after Boston Mayor Michelle Wu testified before Congress alongside 3 other blue state mayors who lead so-called sanctuary cities. I'm joined by Sarang Sekhavat, Chief of Staff at the Massachusetts Immigrant and Refugee Advocacy Coalition, or MIRA. We're going to talk TPS, sanctuary cities, and how Massachusetts immigrant populations are positioned right now. So, Sarang, thanks for being here with me.
Oh, it's a pleasure. Thanks for having me.
So we're talking one day after Mayor Michelle Wu was in Washington, D.C. to talk about sanctuary city status or whatever that means, because as we're going to talk about, that doesn't really have a clear, uniform definition. Right. And she was up there with a few other blue state mayors to essentially defend the city's approach to immigration, ICE cooperation. So let's start off there. When you see people talking about sanctuary city status, what is that signaling to you? What does that mean?
Well, I mean, that's sort of the problem, isn't it? It means different things to different people. For us, what we're really looking for is, it's not sanctuary is not about saying, oh, you're protected from X, Y, and Z. It's not like we're prohibiting law enforcement or anything like that. All we're really trying to say is that the city's criminal law enforcement doesn't need to be involved in federal civil law enforcement. And that's all we mean by a sanctuary city.
So I assume you either kind of caught up with or watched some parts of Mayor Wu's testimony before Congress. What stood out to you? Because we're also going to talk about the sort of back in Boston rally angle of it. But what struck you about kind of the way that she talked about Boston's policy?
What really struck me isn't so much the way she talked about Boston's policy, but it's really the attacks by a lot of the representatives on the committee who, they have nothing except falsehoods to try and support their position. And I think that Mayor Wu was very good about pushing back on a lot of this, pointing out that we have, for example, lower crime rates than most of their districts.
And one of the things to kind of get to the Republican sort of pressure points that they brought up several times, one of the critiques was often to say, well, here is an example of an undocumented person who committed this sort of heinous crime. Are you telling me that the city of Boston would not hand them over to officials, immigration officials, if they were asked? And the mayor's response was very often, well, if ICE goes and gets a criminal warrant for them, then of course we'll cooperate. Do you think there's a genuine disconnect between what these two sides are talking about or a deliberate misrepresentation?
I think it is a deliberate misrepresentation. I think we see it across a lot of D.C. right now. We have an administration right now that's complaining about all these criminals when they're not criminals. They're complaining that these people are here illegally when they're not. And in fact, the real problem is that they're taking away the legal status. They're pulling the rug out from under all these people.
And so back in Boston, one thing that was very interesting to us as we were kind of reporting on it is even folks who have disagreed with the mayor in the past, either on the city council or Josh Kraft, who's actually running against her to try to be mayor of the city of Boston, we're all sort of coming down on the same side of this, which is that Boston sort of specifically does like that it has this Trust Act here. MIRA was involved in organizing a rally outside of City Hall for this. Tell me a little bit about what the goal is and the response that you saw.
Well, the goal of the rally really was just to say that we appreciate the work that Mayor Wu's doing. I think a lot of the problems with our immigration policies right now are about who the politicians are hearing from. We see it over and over again where there's a lot of support for immigration reform, but those aren't the people who the politicians are hearing from. They're hearing mostly from the folks who, want to end immigration into the country. So this was just an opportunity for us to sort of celebrate good policy.
And is that true also in Massachusetts? There was a little bit of discussion about whether or not, in an effort to kind of whack sanctuary city mayors, the Republicans might have misstepped a bit, because often this is something that comes up at the state policy level. A lot of state immigration policy is, of course, set by the governor, the legislature. It can be interpreted by the state courts. There's a limited amount that any city and town can do. So can you talk to me a little bit about how Massachusetts cities and towns are approaching sort of ICE cooperation and how that relates to what is and isn't present at the state level?
Yeah, I mean, I think it is, there's a lot of cities who we think are really doing a great job of trying to say all of our residents are basically equal. All of our residents are protected. But it is a little bit problematic when you're talking about, different policies from city to city. You might live in one city and work in another city, and two totally different policies. The piecemeal approach is a little bit challenging, and that's part of the reason why we are trying to get a statewide policy enacted.
And what does that look like?
What it would look like would be fairly similar to the Boston policy. The idea is that we're not going to just kind of hand people over to ICE. These are people who, they have been through the criminal system and they are done with that. And that's kind of the point. And so to now say, well, we're going to now hand you over to civil authorities can be really problematic for a lot of reasons. There's been some appetite at the state level, but it's been difficult to get anything passed at the state level, frankly. We've seen this, for example, get approved by committees over and over and over again and just never come up for a floor vote. It's not specific to the Safe Communities Act that we're trying to push. We see it with all kinds of bills on all kinds of issues across the state.
And does it help at all to look at what other states in the country are doing? Like many people in Massachusetts, I was not born in Massachusetts, and so I've lived in a few different states. Have there been ones with things that we're modeling this off of here, or is there something specific about Massachusetts that we're tailoring for?
No, it is really modeled off of what we've seen in other places. California was one of the first places to do something like this, and that very much became a model for a lot of the cities and states that are passing policies like this. But even beyond that, one of our other priorities this year is the Immigrant Legal Defense Act, which would provide attorneys for people who are facing deportation, facing the end of their livelihoods. And that's really modeled after something that came out of New York years ago that was actually piloted by a federal appeals judge. They have shown not only that it's effective in helping their communities, but also economically effective, because you're talking about not losing employees or employers even. You're talking about families that are able to keep their income maybe, and so don't have to rely on city, state, federal benefits or whatever the case may be. This is actually, it has a positive economic impact.
So I'm so glad that you brought up the economics of this, because in all of the discussions around immigration policy, there's sort of two hands at the same time. You've got kind of the social, moral side of it, and then you've also got the fact that immigrants, of course, are real people working real jobs in real states with real impacts here. One of the points of contention that came up in the context of the hearing yesterday, when we're recording this, so of course a few days ago when anyone's listening to this, was that Boston, unlike some other cities, doesn't track immigration status when it's figuring out how to dole out city support. So we don't have a strong understanding, for instance, of what the cost is of providing those supports. Seems to me at least like there might be sort of a two-sided part of that there, which is on one angle, it means that it might be hard then if you wanted to allocate funding to meet that need if you don't know exactly what the need is. But then on the flip side, the critique is, well, then we don't know if there's some sort of drain on city resources if we're not collecting it. So how are you thinking about either in the context of a legal defense fund for navigating the system, but then also in terms of city and state resources, shelter programs, that sort of thing, that are going to kind of support people who are here without documentation?
I think one thing that really gets lost in the discussion a lot, although we try and bring it up as much as possible. There's so much talk about all these people, immigrants cost so much, but we rarely talk about the taxes that they're paying. We say, oh, why are they in our schools? Well, they're paying property taxes just like everyone else is. They're paying sales taxes just like everyone else is. They're paying income taxes using ITIN numbers. The interesting thing is that the things that they are doing to benefit are things that this administration, again, is trying to take away. They're trying to make it harder for people to file their taxes.
Right before tax season.
Yeah, exactly, and which just seems counterproductive. So, there's reasons why we do these kind of supports in the first place. And it is because overall, for the economic health of our communities, it's a benefit. It means that money is flowing. That businesses still have their customers, for example.
So we're discussing some of the things that the Trump administration has decided to either actively roll back or try to roll back. A lot of this has to do with immigration and immigration supports. At the end of February, there was an announcement from the Department of Homeland Security that it would essentially be pulling the rug out from under those from Haiti and Venezuela who are covered by TPS. So talk to me a little bit about why that is, I'm sure, in your view, a problem.
It's a huge problem. And, there's so many reasons why it's a problem. First off, a lot of these people, especially when you're talking about Haitians with TPS, many of them have been here for a very long time. Some of them since the earthquake first happened in 2010. Some maybe even longer than that. So we're talking about people who, 15 years, they've established a life. They've probably built families here. And now you're talking about tearing those families apart. They are employers or employees. And now you're talking about the economic impact of losing that. But more to the point, I think, there are push factors in a lot of these countries that are why people are coming here. And if you start sending all these people back to their home countries that, Haiti especially, not in any kind of position to be able to absorb them back into their society economically, socially, politically, whatever, you're just creating more instability in those countries and now creating more of a push factor to drive them back into the U.S.
Does it feel different, the same, almost the same as last time? Because there was a similar effort under the first Trump administration.
Some of the things are very, very much the same, but we're seeing a lot of things that are quite a bit different. They're going a lot farther than they tried last time. The birthright citizenship executive order is a prime example of that. Also, the degree to which they're trying to take status away from people who have been trying to do things the right way. But, we'll see a lot of the same things as well. I'm expecting things like slowing down processing of applications and just putting as many obstacles in the way as they can for people.
And did MIRA and you learn anything in particular about how the administration would like to approach TPS and other sorts of immigration supports and protections from the first administration? Are there new techniques or responses, or are there just kind of the classics?
It's kind of the classics. I think one thing that happened last time is that there's been a lot more collaboration among organizations all across the country, and a lot more planning going on, and a lot more just sort of making sure we're all on the same page. But one thing we really have found is the most impactful hasn't changed, which is the lawsuits to try and stop them. The lawsuits to say what you're doing is in violation of the Administrative Procedures Act or this or the Constitution, now where we're at.
Right. As we're talking right now, earlier this week, a lawsuit was brought from the Massachusetts-based Lawyers for Civil Rights on behalf of Haitian and Venezuelans in Massachusetts, arguing essentially that you can't just yank TPS status, essentially. How are you I mean, it's early days yet, obviously, and many things are still working their way through the courts, including the question of, is the executive order purporting to roll back birthright citizenship even constitutional? So how are you feeling about the chances of courts being a bulwark here?
It's a bit of a mixed bag. Lawyers for Civil Rights, I think, are an amazing organization, and I don't know that I would trust anyone more than I would trust them to be leading some of these lawsuits. At the same time, I do get very worried about the way that the courts have changed over the last few years, particularly with all the judges that Trump had appointed in the last time around, and the way that they're going to be looking at a lot of these things. Particularly worried about how the Supreme Court's going to look at some of these with the partisan mix that it has right now. I think, 10 years ago, you might have seen very different court decisions than you might see now.
And I think it can be helpful sometimes for listeners to think about, what does this actually mean? How does this affect people in sort of normal life? And one thing that came to mind as we were thinking about this episode here is Haitian immigrants, specifically in Massachusetts, fill a lot of healthcare roles,
yes,
especially elder care. So can you tell me what are some of the industries that you're watching in particular as being particularly impacted by the TPS changes?
I do think the healthcare industry is really one of the main ones. Like you said, we do see Haitians serving in a lot of roles in the medical industry. There's certainly a lot of concern about the construction industry and the impact that's going to have, especially at a time like now when we have such a housing crisis, but yet you're going to take away the people who will actually be building houses. Again, counterproductive on the part of this administration.
And what does that sort of end up meaning in terms of ripple effects? Like, let's say that you lose a significant chunk of elder care workers. What sorts of strains does that put down system? There's
so many strains. I mean, simply put, when you don't have the people to actually provide the services, what's going to happen to those people who need the services? What's going to happen to our elder population? When they don't have those home visits anymore? How are they going to, many of them can't get around. That's the whole point of the home visits, or can't get around safely at least. Plus, I think you're just going to see a contracting economy. When you have businesses that are losing their employees, they can't meet the demand. They don't have the supply anymore to meet the demand. When you have those employees also stop being able to pay, they can't afford to put food on the table now for these families. Well, now are they going to have to, sort of like I implied with the Immigrant Legal Defense Act, well, are they now going to have to rely on the government for supports? So you're really talking about taking huge amounts of money out of the economy and shifting the burden more onto government and onto taxpayers.
And how is MIRA thinking of the balancing act here, where one of the reasons that the sanctuary city hearing was so fraught is not just because a number of representatives said, I'm planning on seeing if we can bring obstruction of justice charges against some of the mayors, but because there are billions of federal dollars at stake here, where there's not really a lot of certainty about how much the Trump administration or the Doge organization, which the president confirmed is headed up by Elon Musk, can turn off these spigots here. So how are you thinking about the question of sort of defending immigration policy that might not be popular to an administration that has shown a desire to be punitive, at least in wielding some financial levers?
It's really more about, it's not even so much about defending immigration policy. It's about defending all the residents of Massachusetts, because the amount of benefits that immigrants are eligible for is a tiny slice of what we're really talking about here. Very few are eligible for much at all, especially not federal spending. So when you talk about cutting off that federal spending, that you're talking about impacting U.S. citizens and green card holders, longtime green card holders, by the way. So, it's not like it's the immigrant population that's going to be suffering. It's everyone.
I'm glad you brought that up. One of the panelists in front of Congress was a researcher from the Libertarian Cato Institute who noted, of course, that there are these complicated downstream impacts around not just the correlation between immigration and tax bases, but also immigration and crime rates, the discussion of whether or not there will be cooperation with law enforcement if people feel like they might be subject to mass deportation. And the final thing that he noted, and it's why I bring this up, is that there have been documented instances, more than many people might expect, of people who are documented or U.S. citizens who are still getting kind of caught up in the even limited ICE raids that we've seen so far. Yeah. So, I mean, I don't really have like a very specific question here, but it does seem like there is an issue with communicating this is not just something that's targeting those without documentation.
And we've seen this kind of across the board. Another example would be the SAVE Act at the federal level, which, they're trying to say, you need to show proof of citizenship in order to register to vote nationally. The argument against that has always been we have so many U.S. citizens who can't prove their citizenship. It's the same problem we run into with benefits access. The more onerous you make those verification requirements, the more people who are eligible for these things are going to be cut off. And then who are they going to then blame? It always seems to be the government's fault, but not, the people who are actually making these laws. And, their own representatives who are making these laws are their favorites.
And you mentioned, of course, the housing crisis. We're here in Massachusetts. There's an incredible shelter shortage right now that's gotten very interwoven into the discussion around migration rates and border security. How are you feeling about how the state is handling its shelter system and immigrant population right now?
We're slipping a little. Let's be honest. I think initially the State House was very responsive, very in touch with the needs, not just of the people who are coming here, but the communities that they're living in, the organizations that are working with them. But it seems to be that they're getting tired of spending money. They're forgetting that these are actual human beings in need. It's a real problem. And because it's been used as such a political football, I think, and again, so much around, look at the claims around, for example, Aurora, Colorado, or Springfield, Ohio. Again, the only way they can really justify these policies is by lying about, what the impact of having these people in our communities is.
And to clarify, with the Aurora instance, it is that folks are being kind of shipped in as well, and the claims around crime rates.
Exactly. And then claiming that everyone in the one apartment building is a member of a gang when it's just not true.
So how does a state, this is a broader policy question, how does a state like Massachusetts then, with limited resources and limited housing, try and grapple with the scale of need in this situation?
Well, I think part of the problem is that it really shouldn't be just up to the state. And I think Mayor Wu was trying to point this out yesterday. There's so much more that Congress should be doing, and yet they're actually doing the exact opposite of what the states really need to support and what the people really need to support for their support.
So what initiatives should we be keeping an eye on as this continues to roll out? Sometimes it feels a little bit insane that we're only, a month into the new administration. There's been so many developments. As I noted, there's still 1.5 million executive orders making their way through the courts facing challenge here. We'll keep an eye on the TPS status. But what other plates is MIRA spinning right now?
Well, the parole is a really big issue. These folks who came to the border looking for humanitarian protection are allowed into the country, allowed to work. And we're seeing more and more efforts to take that status away. Again, pulling the rug out from under people who've tried to do things the lawful way and so far have done it. We're going to see, really hundreds of thousands of people lose status. We're seeing an immigration court system that already has a backlog of about 3.5 million, where they just said, okay, we're not hiring a bunch of judges. which means you're just slowing that down even more. If you think 3.5 million is a big backlog, let's see what it is in a couple of years after these policies. You're going to see just so many more families and communities feel like they are being pushed back into the shadows and not feeling safe talking to, for example, police when they're the victims or witnesses of crimes. Not safe applying for, say, food stamps for their U.S. citizen children. So now you're talking about punishing U.S. citizens again.
And I think the last question here is, how are politicians doing with the messaging here? There's been a lot of kind of soul-searching or diagnosing that specifically Democrats have been doing around why they lost the presidency, the House, the Senate, even though, of course, there's still some narrow margins there. How are they doing talking about immigration?
Well, it's very much a mixed bag. We've certainly got some folks who are great out there, but we also have some folks who've really lost the plot and lost the fact that we are just talking about human beings, and instead are treating it as a political issue rather than a humanitarian issue. And we've seen this come from some of our folks in D.C. who used to be very strong allies, who have been sort of backtracking a bit. But I think now we're starting to see some of the reaction to what this administration's doing, and now they're kind of moving back into the humanitarian camp.
I mean, I don't know if you want to name names on this, but is there kind of a category of politicians that you're seeing kind of doing that boomeranging?
I would say sort of the more centrist of the Democrats is where we're mostly seeing that. I think others had, some move back, some don't. But, immigration used to be a very central issue. George W. Bush was trying to get us immigration reform pushed through. Reagan was the one who got the Immigration Reform and Control Act done in the 80s. This didn't used to be a partisan issue, and now it has become very partisan and, very much used as a hammer.
And is that true in Massachusetts as well?
Not to the same degree, but I think we do see some of it here in Massachusetts, absolutely. I think we're better, but, we have a long way to go.
Thanks again to Sarang Sekhavat for joining me on the Codcast. Thank you so much for listening. I'm Jennifer Smith. Our producer is John Gee. Leave a rating and review wherever you're hearing this now if you want to help other people find us, and email codcast@commonwealthbeacon.org if you ever want to get in touch directly. We'll be back in your ears next week.